Welcome, everyone. I'm Frances Hayashida, the Director of the Latin American and Iberian Institute, or LAII, at the University of New Mexico. The LAII promotes and supports interdisciplinary teaching, research, and meaningful public engagement to advance the production and dissemination of knowledge about Latin America and Iberia. Latin America is designated as one of 7 priority areas of research for UNM, and we proudly contribute to both the university's intellectual community as well as local and global discourse through programming. We'd like to take a moment to first recognize the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia on which UNM sits. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. Today we'll be hearing from LAII Research Associate Oliver Horn, who received his PhD in International History from Georgetown University. He is the co-founder and a consultant at Sun Mountain Consulting, a historical consulting firm in Santa Fe. Dr. Horn's talk is titled Colombia's Cold War, Pursuit of Economic Development and the Emergence of Drug Trafficking, 1958 to 1979. In this talk, he'll examine the causes and consequences of Colombia's sudden and unprecedented emergence as a global epicenter of illicit drug production and export during the height of the Cold War in Latin America, and link these causes and consequences to Colombia's relations with the US. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Oliver Horn.
Thank you, Frances, for that very warm introduction. And thank you all for coming today. I am very excited to finally plug in with the Latin American and Iberian Institute and share my research, which my research is on US-Colombian relations during the Cold War. And Colombia is a really interesting case study. Between 1962 in 1975, during this period that it would be considered the height of the Cold War in Latin America, Colombia actually received more US foreign aid than any other country in the region. And in fact, for a period in the first half of the 1970s, Colombia was actually among the top 5 highest US foreign aid recipients in the world. So there was this huge US influence in Colombia during this period. But what's kind of interesting is that most scholars of US foreign relations have chosen to focus on other areas of Latin America during the Cold War, areas that experienced US interventions or military coups or revolutionary insurgencies. But Colombia didn't experience this type of political polarization. Its government was stable, it stayed civilian, and any sort of leftist regime or leftist insurgents remained weak and marginalized throughout this period. So it really didn't resemble any of these other Cold War battlefields in Latin America in the 60s and 70s. The flip side is that this period also hasn't attracted a lot of attention from scholars of modern Colombian history, where the historiography, the emphasis is on these periods of intense violence that unfolded in the country. The biggest one was this civil war that occurred between 1946 and 1948, known as La Violencia, when over 200,000 Colombians died. And then the other big emphasis has been from the 1980s to the present, where you had the emergence of the war on drugs and these revolutionary insurgencies and these bouts of violence. So this middle period hasn't received as much attention, and so that's what I'm going to focus on today. And really, I'm going to look at the nature of US influence and its impact on Colombia's development. And you can see this where in 1962, which was the first year that US foreign aid came to Colombia, Colombia was the second largest exporter of coffee in the world. And almost all of this commodity went to the United States. By 1975, the last year of the US foreign aid program, marijuana and cocaine had surpassed coffee as Colombia's main export. But all of this was still going to the United States. So there were these continuities and changes. But by and large, this transformation was connected to the projection of US power and influence within the country. And I argue that US Cold War aid shaped the nature of Colombia's economic development during this period and also shaped its integration into the global economy. And this entire process is an overlooked chapter of both the Cold War and Colombian history. So today, I think putting this presentation together, I've realized that I've bitten off a bit more than I can chew. I'm going to talk about these series of key events and themes that occurred during the 1960s and 70s, and that hopefully illustrate the dramatic changes to Colombia's political economy and its relationship with the United States. And I would just, if anyone, at any point, please, I'm happy to go into much greater detail on any one of these components in the Q&A. Okay, so I want to begin this presentation with this meeting at the Metropolitan Club on November 23rd, 1960. And here is the memo of the meeting written by the Colombian ambassador at the time, Ambassador Carlos Sanz de Santa Maria. And this meeting that happened, it was a meeting between a group of Latin American ambassadors and Thomas Mann, who was this high-ranking State Department diplomat. He was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Inter-American Affairs. So he was a major mover and shaker in US Latin American policy. And so at this meeting between these North American and Latin American, South American diplomats, the topic of discussion was what to do with the Cuban revolutionary regime, which was then nearly 2 years old. And Mann, he presented the US perspective on events. And from his view and the US view was that Cuba was destabilizing Latin America by exporting revolution through the rest of the region. And he wanted Latin American support to contain the Cuban influence. But the Colombian ambassador actually pushed back at these assertions. And he agreed that instability was growing within Latin America, but, and here's a quote from him, he argued that the cause of the region's growing turmoil was not solely the result of Castro's influence, but also due to the traditional collection of miseries and inequalities found within Latin American societies. And so in his view, he was arguing that the Cuban Revolution and the specter of communism was really a symptom of deeper structural problems within Latin America, and really tied to social and economic inequalities. And what he also relayed, and this was the Colombian government's perspective as well, was that this inequality that existed in the region, it wasn't just the product of traditional or deep standing internal dynamics within these countries. Instead, they argued that it was also a product of the boom and bust cycle of commodity exports, which were crucial to essentially every single Latin American country's economy during this period. And just some context for this is that starting in the late 1950s, commodity prices across Latin America went into a downturn. Things like oil, tin, coffee, sugar, these all declined. And this led to major economic problems across the region. And from, at least in this memo, here was a Latin American pushing this idea that the instability, it wasn't Cuba, it wasn't communism, but due to these, the system of trade that existed. So big picture is what you have here is that the US perspective was that the problem that Latin America faced was mostly political and mostly tied to Cuba and the spread of communism, whereas the Colombian and Latin American perspective, because as the ambassador noted in this memo, nearly or every other Latin American ambassador at this meeting agreed with him, was this view that the Cuban Revolution was a symptom of these broader economic problems. And again, the key part here was that a source of instability was the nature of the region's trade relationship with the US. And that this trade relationship was a source of turmoil. So these are the two dividing lines that were unfolding. So that meeting reflected, and I'm going to talk in kind of general terms right now, reflected the policies of the president at the time, his administration, Alberto Lleras Camargo. And because he had come into office in 1958 in the wake of this, over 10 years of civil war and military rule. And they were looking to patch things up. And this civil war only ended when the leaders of both political parties agreed to form a coalition government and share power. And Lleras Camargo was the first leader of this coalition, system of coalition governments was known as the National Front. But what's key is that, this National Front arrangement was set up to prevent further partisan conflict. But Lleras Camargo also realized that the country's deep disparities had also fueled turmoil and had contributed to the violence during the Civil War. And this is, in his inaugural address in 1958, he argued that the country's turmoil was the product of this abysmal gulf in income inequality and the subhuman standard of living for the poor. And so in his idea was that these inequalities needed to be addressed to prevent further political unrest and violence. And so his key domestic policy was this general plan for social and economic development, which had kind of three components to it. One was to diversify commodity exports away from coffee. Two was to pursue industrialization. And three was to dramatically increase government services, increase access to education, healthcare, and build infrastructure. And the idea was, again, to raise the standard of living. Seemed like a pretty good plan. But the problem that he ran into was the collapse of coffee prices. And so coffee was Colombia's main export, but the problem was that starting about the year before Lleras Camargo came to office, the price of coffee started to dip. And you see in the 56, 57 growing seasons, and then the 57 and 58 growing seasons, the price of coffee dipped by about 30%. And this was a huge deal because, again, coffee comprised about 80% of Colombia's exports, and about 80% of the coffee exports went to the United States. And this was crucial because these coffee exports generated foreign earnings, basically generated US dollars that importers could then use to import important capital goods. Things like machinery for factories that were crucial to industrializing, or tractors to modernize agriculture. And as these coffee exports dried up, the country started to run a massive trade deficit of over $120 million, and they experienced a shortage of foreign currency, which meant that it became incredibly difficult to continue to import foreign goods. And on top of that, it denied the government the resources to pursue this big development program. So there were these structural imbalances that needed to be addressed, but there wasn't the resources within the country to actually pursue it. And so the only source of, the only place that the country, or that Lleras Camargo determined that Colombia could get these resources from, was from the United States. And Lleras Camargo pushed the United States to provide economic aid to Colombia and the rest of Latin America to alleviate, his big argument was that this would alleviate instability within the region. And again, I'm gonna gloss over all of his diplomatic maneuvering, but big picture is when the Kennedy administration came into office in 1961, they pledged this massive economic aid program to Latin America, became known as the Alliance for Progress, and it was, the biggest foreign aid program since the Marshall Plan. And Lleras Camargo, he became perhaps the single greatest proponent in all of Latin America for this program. And in the wake of the Bay of Pigs invasion in April of 61, which caused much of the rest of Latin America or other Latin American leaders to cool on the idea of greater US involvement in the region. Lleras Camargo, he lobbied other Latin American governments to sign on to the Alliance for Progress Charter at the Punta del Este Conference in August of 1961. And then he also led the charge to expel Cuba from the Organization of American States at the start of 1962. And he did this, he was not concerned with Cuba, and he certainly wasn't concerned about the spread of communism within Colombia. His biggest concern was he thought that if Cuba was expelled, which is what the United States wanted, that would appease the United States enough to ensure that this development money started to flow into places like Colombia. So he did all of these things, but in the end, when he cut a deal for a US loan in 1962, just months after Cuba was expelled from the OAS, it proved to be a huge disappointment for him. The loan was only $30 million, far less than what could be used to underwrite a national development program and restructure the country's economy. And second, which was even more humiliating for him in many ways, was that the US tied these loans to dealing with the trade deficit, and it did not permit the Colombian government from using these funds to actually fund development projects. And so the repercussions for this was that this effort to pursue a national development program was gutted. And the government was instead forced to embrace austerity, and these efforts to rebalance the economy were disrupted. So the question would be, well, why? Why did this happen? And there's a number of reasons, but some of them that are probably most important was the fact that in the end, the United States wasn't interested in helping Colombia restructure its economy. This was an economic relationship between the two countries that was favorable to the United States. Colombia produced low-end coffee that it exported to the US, and in return, it used those proceeds to import high-end finished capital goods. So the US was the big winner in this trade relationship. But also, the other key component was that, from the perspective of US officials, they, unlike their Colombian counterparts, they did not view Colombia's economic problems as connected to international trade and ties with the US, but rather due to the internal conditions within the country. And they believed that the country's economy could be stabilized if, instead of industrializing and diversifying, if the country doubled down on commodity exports and embraced export-driven growth. And so in the end, this US foreign aid undermined the Colombian vision of economic development. And so efforts at diversification halted, and instead the trade relationship between the two countries remained intact. And really it illustrates how difficult it was for Colombian and other Latin American leaders to pursue economic development during a period when the backbone of their economies was in a downturn. All right, so that kind of sets the stage. And these, the US loans continued to have a pernicious impact throughout the rest of the 60s on Colombia and its development. So I'm gonna skip over some things here, but I'm just gonna give you guys, the big picture is that the US, starting under Lleras Camargo's successor, President Guillermo Leon Valencia, continued to provide loans to the country, but demanded that the government devaluate the peso. And this created unrest in the country, and it led to this series of, each year, these brutal negotiations between the Colombian and US governments to get these loans. And from the US perspective, the belief was that if Colombia devalued its currency, that would make its products cheaper in the international market and therefore fuel exports, which would allow its economy to grow. From the Colombian government's perspective, the devaluing the currency created inflation, caused the cost of living to grow, which was a real hardship on the population and could lead to instability that could potentially overthrow the government. So again, these were the dynamics shaping these series of brutal negotiations. And in the end, each time the Colombian government, assented to the US government's wishes and devalued its currency bit by bit. And big picture is that this created, there were a couple of repercussions of this. The biggest was that there was just a fundamental lack of development that happened during this period. Per capita GDP between 1962 and 1966 only averaged 1.3% growth each year, which was well below the rate of population growth, which was about 3.2%. So essentially, the per capita Colombians were becoming poorer during this period. And then on top of that, agricultural production declined by over 10%. And there was a tiny fraction of the anticipated manufacturing jobs that arose in the cities. And also there was this huge increase in inflation, which averaged about over 15% a year during this period. And between 1963 and 1969, the cost of living within Colombia grew by nearly 100%. So things got twice as expensive. And because of this, Colombians endured this shortage of goods, including basic foodstuffs. And during this period, the average per capita caloric intake actually decreased below 2,500 calories a day, meaning that many Colombians were malnourished, and there's a pretty good guess that significant numbers were actually starving. And so the country's overall standard of living actually declined. And then within this, and I'm happy to go into more detail on this in the Q&A, but this was the period where you had the rise of these revolutionary insurgencies, that there was a shift from, former liberal guerrilla bands in the countryside or bandits, and they coalesced into these revolutionary insurgency groups. Most notably, FARC and ELN formed in 1964 and 1965, and these groups, they wanted to overthrow the government. And so there was a distinct shift in how unrest in the countryside developed at this point. So the question is, I'll go back, is so if material conditions within the country were declining and you had these rise of revolutionary insurgencies, it seemed like Colombia was on the precipice of conflict, of unrest, that it was on the precipice of polarization, a similar type of polarization that was unfolding in other parts of Latin America during this period. But that didn't happen. And one of the big reasons it didn't happen, or at least what I argue, is because Colombians began to adapt to these conditions. And there was this rise of illicit activities within the country, which already had a deep history, deep tradition of illicit activities. Here is a memo written to the Colombian president at the time, Carlos Lleras Restrepo, actually the cousin of Alberto Lleras Camargo, detailing, it's from 1967, and it's detailing this money laundering ring. And basically this report details how there was about this ring of about 40 prominent businessmen, industrialists, bankers, economists who were cycling money through a series of banks within the country to this border town, Cucuta, along the Colombian-Venezuelan border. And they were transferring these pesos and exchanging them for dollars that originated from Chase Manhattan Bank in New York City. And they could then, this was a way to squirrel their money abroad, as well as they could take these dollars that they were getting and sell them on the black market within Colombia, make money off of it. This is just an example, a documented example of some of these illicit activities that were arising, but there were many others as well, along with money laundering, over and under invoicing, and smuggling, especially coffee. About 15% by some estimates of Colombia's coffee production were smuggled out of the country. Lots of smuggling of cattle and emeralds out of the country. And in return, Colombians smuggled in foreign goods. And this, at the time, this wasn't viewed as criminal. These activities weren't viewed as criminal, but instead, just people were just trying to survive. People, it was accepted in a way to survive this period where low coffee prices, shortage of foreign currency, and the high price of goods. This is what people did to survive. And I tried to find, I've got this other document. I couldn't find it, but well, let me get to it in a second. So as this rise in illicit activities was happening in the latter half of the 60s, something else was happening, and that was happening in the United States, where this new commodity market was emerging, where marijuana and cocaine suddenly grew in popularity in terms of its consumption. And by 1971, the US government estimated that as much as 5 to 6% of the US population regularly consumed marijuana. And by just a couple of years later, by 1974, this number had jumped to 10%. Take these numbers with a grain of salt, but it suggests that this was the emergence of a massive new commodity market. And for comparison's sake, coffee, the coffee market in the United States, about a little over 60% of the US population consumed coffee daily. So suddenly there were this new demand for these new commodities. And Colombia, because of its pre-existing illicit activities, it was easy for these entrepreneurs to shift into drug production and export to the US. And here, so I have this other document, I couldn't find it, but I promise it exists, where it shows, so on this, in this memo to the Colombian president, if you guys look at the bottom, it has a gentleman's name by the name of Joseph E. Lizer and Tia. Well, this guy that was mentioned, who was bringing the money down from New York and exchanging it on the Colombian-Venezuelan border, at the same time, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was investigating him for smuggling cocaine from Colombia to Miami. And I was unable to determine if the two governments ever compared notes on these parallel investigations, but it shows that this infrastructure know-how was already in place as demand in the United States for these new commodities grew. So the Colombians adapted, and marijuana and cocaine emerged as these vibrant new industries within the country. Just some quick examples: by early 1970s, there was at least 40,000 marijuana farmers that initially were in the Atlantic coastal region, and then production spread down along the Magdalena River Valley. And at the same time, there was cocaine processing emerged in many of the major cities. And so these huge new industries emerged. And as these industries emerged, Colombia experienced this unprecedented period of economic growth. Between 1970 and 74, the country's GDP on average grew at about 6.5% a year, which was the highest rate for Colombia in the entire 20th century. This was this one period of intense economic growth. And then on top of that, this trade deficit, which had plagued the Colombian economy for years, it switched over into a surplus. Suddenly there was an excess of foreign investment coming into the country, of foreign capital. And in the end, this led to what you could call the zenith of US-Colombian relations, because in 1975, President Lleras Restrepo visited the White House, visited his counterpart, President Ford, and he told him, "We have decided we don't need your help anymore. You can use this foreign aid funds for needy countries." So he was saying that Colombia was no longer a needy country. It no longer needed development assistance. And as a result, the US phased out this aid program and declared Colombia a development success. That Colombia, under US economic tutelage, had found a path towards development through these commodity exports. Maybe not the exports that these US officials had anticipated or even liked, but that had happened. So, but this wasn't this short-term success. There was this shift in US-Colombian relations in the years after. And it actually started under the Carter administration, where basically the Carter administration, the shift was that the US government no longer, as the exigencies of the Cold War receded, the US government no longer viewed the Colombian government as a reliable Cold War ally, and instead, as the war on drugs took precedent, started to view the Colombian government as complicit in this new industry. And This is a report, it's 40-something pages long, that from the DEA that the Carter administration used this report, it details nearly 40 Colombian officials and their involvement in the drug trafficking industry. And most of them were mid-level people, but it included the Minister of Defense was implicated, some congressmen, but the single biggest figure in this report was the liberal presidential candidate, Julio Cesar Torbe, who was the leading contender for the presidency in the 1978 elections. And so from the US perspective was that the government was complicit and that this was a new problem. This was a major problem. And this really marked this shift in, so the view was that the view was that once Torbe came into power, the US put immense pressure on him to demonstrate that he was harsh on traffickers. And so at this point, he launched Operation Fulminante in 1979, which was the first major US-backed counter-narcotic campaign. It was along the Atlantic coast. And it comprised aerial spraying, crop burnings, and the first widespread allegations of human rights abuses. And this outraged the populace. And essentially, there was this violence at this point, for the first time since La Violencia, violence accelerated. And the support for groups, for these revolutionary groups like FARC and ELN, which had numbered only in the hundreds throughout most of the 70s, they were not popular. Suddenly, the number of people joining them surged significantly. And so you see that in this case, this was a new era of US intervention, where the US was no longer devoting foreign aid to solidify, to promote these commodity exports to the United States. Instead, it was devoting it to disrupt them. Even though the US had helped shape this industry. And it antagonized the population, led to further violence, further instability, and in the end, it did not disrupt the flow of drugs between the two countries. Colombia was oriented to servicing the US market, and no amount of counter-narcotics operations were going to disrupt the demand of millions of US consumers. This relationship that emerged was subsequently defined US-Colombian relations in the wake of the Cold War. Okay, so conclusions. What does all of this tell us? Unlike other parts of Latin America, most notably Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, where these areas had long traditions dating back until at least the 19th century, and oftentimes going back much further, of drug consumption, drug production, and drug trade. Colombia emerged as a center of drug trafficking only in the 1970s. And this was connected with the projection of US influence during the Cold War. And again, these policies weren't aimed at waging anti-communism like they were elsewhere, but rather turning Colombia into this model of economic development. And there was this push to focus on commodity exports rather than other paths to development, such as industrialization. and really to maintain the existing character of the trade relationship between the two countries and maintain this favorable relationship for the US. But in the end, Colombians adopted to these conditions and they diversified their economy through drugs. It just wasn't the manner that US officials anticipated or approved of once the Cold War actually ended. And so this tells us that the drug industry was a product of the Cold War. It was a product of US influence and as much as any sort of internal conditions within the country. And finally, it tells us that it was a product of the global economy, that the US was instrumental in fashioning and overseeing. Thank you.